As Mary said, in our ongoing efforts to enhance diversity in economics, today we are focusing on a crucial stage in economics diversity pipeline and on recruitment specifically. When thinking about recruitment, we tend to think about hiring the most suitable candidate for the role. However, it's not always clear what makes a candidate suitable. And there is potential for bias to creep in very easily when we are making these decisions. After all, recruitment is inherently subjective, is liable to both conscious and unconscious biases, and these can particularly impact marginalized groups. Research shows that this cannot be addressed by training courses or unconscious biases alone, but we need to reimagine and redesign our recruitment processes to mitigate bias influence. The bad news, as Mary already said, is that I do not have a ready-to-go list for you to bring back to your institutions and change these practices and get done with this. If this list existed, I promise I will send you an email and we will be done. But that's the reason why we need these meetings. We need to talk to each other. We need to find out how we're going to do this. Instead, today, we have brought together a great panel. You can see now their names on the screen. And they are ready here to share their best practices, the challenges that they have faced, and hopefully some key learning points for all of us to take back to our institutions. Thank you very much, Denise, Kieran, Faith, and Lisa, or LDM, for being here today. I really, really appreciate your time. I will start with some questions for each panelist, and we'll ask them to keep their answers, please, short, to allow time to further discussion. To the audience, I invite you to post any questions for the panelists in the chat for now. We have a chat chair who will collect some of these questions and then pass them to me. If you really then want to make a question once we finish with the first round of questions, you can raise your hand and we are going to try to moderate the discussion. So let me start with you, Denise. Professor Denise Holtz is an experienced head of the department and current chair of the Education and Training Committee. Her research and work has focused on tackling inequalities in the education sector, including implementing better recruitment and support practices in academia. So here is your question, Denise. Could you please share your experiences in recruiting economists in academia and highlight the changes you found to be the most effective to recruit economists from underrepresented backgrounds?
Thanks, Steffi. I really wish there'd been a session like this when I became a head of department 7 years ago. So after 7 years of sort of recruiting and just trial and error practice, I'll share with you what I think are the three sort of main areas where I think there's an opportunity for us as head of departments. And then if there's time, I'll pitch in with the follow-up question you gave me around why it's important that we don't just stop at the recruitment stage, essentially. So in those first sort of 3 points, I think what we often forget when we have to step into the role of head of department or head of school or whatever, is there's actually an opportunity in that recruitment process to step up and focus on the dynamics of the department and how you can actually use that recruitment process. Too often, we find ourselves in those roles sort of unwillingly. We all have to take a bit of a turn at this chair. That's just how it is. But it is an opportunity to have a real impact on the nature of the department. And I think accepting that up front is a really important thing in this process, accepting your agency. The second thing that I really learned from many years now of recruitment, quite a substantial number of people in light of student number explosions in 2 institutions, was the need to focus that recruitment over what we actually needed for the student body and not really what we needed for ourselves. And that's easier said than done, because our instinct is to look for like-minded souls to join our research centre for whom we could collaborate with. But actually thinking about what we really need for our students. So in one institution, there'd been a big explosion of international students, and thinking about what sort of staff would best help them feel a sense of belonging was the focus for that recruitment. And the second one was where the recruitment for the undergraduate program was predominantly home and very local commuter students, and looking for people who actually understood that experience to be part of the teaching team. Now, that's not to say their research wasn't important. That's a given. They must be able to do that, check. But what was important was then the other aspects that we may not necessarily have included in the criteria, but in what we were looking for on the interview. The second thing was who was on the panel, and I'm really pleased, Steffi, that you've got Tess for speaking later. I'm hoping he'll be with you. But essentially, just thinking about who it is you've got on the panel and why they're there. I mean, some people have to be there for their job role. Some people do not. And the question is if someone has to be there for the job role and they're not on board with the whole inclusive recruitment process, again, taking the agency of head of department and actually calling them out on it in a nice, polite, constructive way, but highlighting that this is the direction of travel for the team, this is important for our community, having those difficult conversations. What is it that's causing this anxiety? And in one particular university, the research prof had not realised that she'd come over that aggressively. So in her need to test for rigour, she'd not realised that that had come over in an unhelpful way, and that conversation was really productive. So again, agency of choosing who's on the panel. And this is particularly important, I think, on the external panel members. You know, not leaving that too late, planning that, really thinking about who you're inviting and why you're inviting that person, looking for that voice that you wouldn't get otherwise to give you a difference of opinion is really important on those panels. So not just looking for like-minded individuals. And then the third one I really want to think about is, you know, I sort of parked to research and said, well, that's not important, is it? But once we've onboarded people, we've obviously got to include people in our community. And I've been working at ARU with our colleagues post, again, another round of extensive recruitment in the School of Economics, Finance and Law to try to expand our existing research centre around economics to include the new group of staff who've been recruited in the last 12 months. And so in having those conversations with the other professors of economics in the division, we've evolved the research centre from the Centre of Pluralistic Economics to the Centre for Inclusive Societies and Economies, and really encouraging the other profs to step up and be mentors for those staff to make sure that it's not just that we're recruiting them to do a great job with our students, but we've got the right mentors in place for their ongoing development. How am I doing for time, Steffi? Do I have a minute?
Yeah, that's great. You have 2 minutes.
That's good. So just very quickly to mention in the 2 minutes, the thing that I mentioned about onboarding, well, it's something that I've really valued at Greenwich in my previous role was taking part in the Stonewall accreditation attempt for the university and being a co-chair for this. And there's some things that we can really learn from processes like Stonewall, like Athena Swan, like the REC. And one of those is around reverse mentoring, acknowledging our own lack of knowledge of different people's lived experiences in academia and actually putting in place structures in a department or school to enable those voices is really important. And the second thing is that if we're really sincere about our beliefs on allyship, you know, partly our professorial duty, I think, is to share our lived experiences of these journeys. We didn't get here as prof easy either. And I think it's important that we share those experiences and also not assume that our staff know how to get to the next stage in their career and step up as profs and actually guide and support as we should be for the next generation. Thanks, Steffi.
Thank you very much, Denise. It's a lot of food for thought, and I'm pretty sure there are also a lot of things that we can learn across sectors as well from there. Sorry. So let me now move to Lisa. Lisa, I think you prefer us to call you LDM, right?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Yes. So LDM is not an economist. In fact, she's a professor in STEM. She's a professor in mechanical engineering at the University of Leeds. STEM is another sector that faces many challenges in trying to increase diversity, but they are also doing a bit better than we are doing. So a lot of challenges, but they are a bit further ahead. Perhaps they started this all earlier. In fact, Lisa is the UK's 41st Black woman professor. There are less than 100 Black women professors in academia in general in the UK. making this one of the most underrepresented groups in academia. Until very recently, until 2018, there were 0 Black women professors in economics. I'm not sure whether this has changed. We are waiting for the new report, for the gender report of the Royal Economic Society to see whether this number has increased. But you can see that we are not doing great in that sense. Lisa worked in supporting, in fact, Black women from the African diaspora in the UK. So a question for you, Lisa. Given your experience and your own journey supporting others, what recruitment strategies can we employ to accelerate the path to having 100 Black women professors in the UK soon, and more in general to increase the representation of Black women in professional roles?
Excellent. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the question. So I put on 2 hats, professor, and also supporting upliftment and visibility of African diaspora and dual heritage, females specifically. So there's 2 parts to that question. So you've got the strategy and you've got the recruitment. So I'm going to focus specifically on the strategy. I would say meet with stakeholders for the purpose of sharing information. Okay, this is really important because we have experienced from the global majority perspective that there are gatekeepers to information. There are gatekeepers to recruitment details. There are gatekeepers to criteria. There are gatekeepers to the soft employment skills. So I say sharing information is really important for 3 reasons. It's really important to share information about the recruitment solutions and the working conditions and the organizational culture, because it's important for us to make up our minds to whether or not we want to be part of an organization. And that's really important. And I'm going to lean into the first bit, which is the organizational culture. Now, the question would be from me to HR managers, HR directors, is how are you recruiting people from the global majority or people from other represented groups? And how is this driven by your strategic intention for your organization? Now, strategic intention is really important. It should focus on recruitment, retention, and reward. And I can see in many organizations with regards to skilled upskilling, there isn't much beyond the recruitment, which is a shame, really, because it then considers us just as labor and not as intended colleagues. I would really look into the role, and I'm looking forward to the HR perspective, looking into what is the role of effective HR direction. And I would say HR direction is important because I see HR directors as both integrators and visualizers, integrating this information about the diversity of culture and also visualizers of that pathway moving forward. When I was growing up, I was very lucky to develop my understanding of the importance of African American diaspora, etc., females, and I grew up with Sadie Alexander, being the first Black economist, and it's such a shame that there isn't that next generation of Black economist professors in the UK. But maybe this will help. I looked back at my past books. I was one of the Black females that grew on Black heroes. And I wrote down, I had all these books, and I wrote down some of the things that were in this book about Sadie, okay? And one of the things that she was really advocating for, and it is applicable today, is the economist, employing people for their specialisms. The next one is considering the economists as coordinators to drive vision. The next one is economists as knowledge and competency agent. The next one is progressive commitment to the project. And the next one is the economist as innovator and adapter. Now, these are all key skills that could be embedded into recruitment criteria. So you have a reflection of the economist as a competent, more so than just a division of labor. So from my perspective, those are the key things that I would consider when looking towards recruitment, but also thinking about that strategy moving forward.
Thank you very much, Aldi. I'm think, again, a lot of food for thought, and we hope to put a lot of these ideas together in the document we circulate at the end. A reminder to the audience, if you have any questions for LDM or Denise so far, please post them in the chat. But let's move to the next panelist, and that's Faith. Faith Elliott is head of human resources at Capital Economics, which is an economics consultancy research business based in London, although hiring economists all around the world. Faith has a long experience working with economists and, of course, in recruiting economists in her role of HR. So the question for Faith is, in the context of hiring economists from underrepresented groups, what are the key challenges that employers encounter in competing from a limited talent pool? After all, we know that there are not many coming through the pipeline. And could you share some experiences with successful practices and any lessons from practices that did not work?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Steffi. Yes, I mean, we do find this a challenge. Speaking of gender alone, only 31% of our economists are female. So we have some work to do. I think one of the biggest challenges for me and in my role as head of HR is to see real change quickly as well. We tend not to lose senior economists. So I think in the last 3 years, we've only hired 2 senior economists. So almost all of our recruitment is at the junior level. And another factor, another challenge is that lack of representation, therefore, at the higher levels. We don't necessarily have as many role models for underrepresented backgrounds. And that speaks really to what LDM was saying. It's important to hire diverse candidates, but it's also really important to make sure that they remain at the company. So make sure that there's that inclusive environment for them to thrive in. I think another challenge is also ensuring that the full hiring team is aware of best practice. HR can be involved a lot, but not in every stage. And whilst they're aware, they should also be on board with what we're doing. So understanding the business needs for diversity, but also that it's the right thing to do. And I think it can't just be pushed through by HR. It needs to be pushed by the senior management team and all areas of the business. Yeah, simply reaching those diverse candidates with the adverts that we put out. And lastly, I think a big challenge is balancing the different elements of diversity and also maintaining fairness. I went to a really good webinar recently on neurodiversity, and they suggested that we send our interview questions to candidates a day before so that they could prepare and be sort of put their best self forward in the interview. But we then wondered whether that might be unfair for low-income students if they're balancing jobs and studying at the same time. So we settled on sending the interview questions just an hour before so that they would have some time to prepare, but also maintain that fairness for all. So speaking of our successful practices, I think one of the biggest successes we've seen is launching our own diversity panel. That was in 2020, and that's a group of 10 of us who meet monthly from all different areas of the business, who are all passionate about improving DE&I, and recruitment practices has been a really important work stream for us during that time. Another really big thing that we've worked on is documenting all of our processes. For recruitment, that's our best practice recruitment guide. It's a working document, so it encourages reflection and suggestions for improvement, and that I think also helps people engage in it because they have some say in how we use it. We also did diversity training with Diverse Matters, who are a really good organisation. I would recommend if anyone's looking into diversity training. Again, just to have that accountability across the company. And then leaning on different networks. Sam worked with Discover Economics, SEO London, which are sponsors for educational opportunity, have been brilliant. The Black Economist networks and Access Aspiration we use for work experience. It's brilliant for finding diverse candidates, but also for advice and knowledge, and knowing that we're not the experts and speaking to other people for advice as well. I think one of the things we're most proud of is our DEI internship, which we launched 2 years ago, and that's an 8-week programme for students in their penultimate year of study who are from low income and underrepresented backgrounds. The reason we did it was to build a pipeline of candidates for our grad scheme and other junior roles, but also to provide an opportunity for those candidates in those underrepresented groups within the industry. We've run it for 2 years now. We've seen progress year on year. We've had great feedback from the interns, and I think that feedback then helps to build it into a successful scheme the following year. We are specifically for people in their cover letters to say why they're a suitable candidate for the scheme. So explain that the scheme is targeted specifically at low income and underrepresented group, and ask them to explain why. I think another really successful thing that we've been doing the last 2 years is the E&I survey for our employees. I'm sure all the economists understand the importance of data, and I think being able to show progress and benchmark yourselves is really, really important. At the last session with the Royal Economic Society on DE&I, they spoke a lot about about how low-income students are more likely to go to universities local to them. So we now focus a lot on advertising to London universities to help us build that lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And we're based in London. Our company is has 115 in London, so that I think has really helped. And we're seeing results. I think I looked at who we've hired over the last 3 years, and 41% have been female. So we are starting to see some good results. Have I got time to say about what's not worked well? It's fairly quick.
1 minute, yes.
1 minute, okay, great. We advertised on LinkedIn for our grad scheme this year, and we're inundated with applicants. The pool was just too big, so we're going to be more targeted next year. So just for universities and the SEO network. I mean, the universities we target is still over 60, so it's still a big pool. We don't prioritise work experience for our junior roles because we just think that that's more likely to be people who've got better access to those opportunities. So it's not as big. We don't score as highly as we used to, and we don't anonymise CVs because we tend to find that those from privileged backgrounds tend to have more polished CVs. So we think it's quite important to have all that information available. But we do anonymise our writing tests, and that gives some really surprising results sometimes. So we continue to do that. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much, Faith. Again, a lot of things, and it just makes me a little bit proud that you said that you came to our second meeting and you took something out of it and you started applying it, and you have even seen change. So everybody added for input. Thank you very much. But we have and I think this goes very well with our next speaker. We have Kieran. And Kieran is now an associate in primary market oversight at the Financial Conduct Authority. But Kieran is fresh from graduation. He was a Warwick student. And during his degree, Kieran did a lot of work. I have to say that I have seen what he has done at Warwick, and I say it's impressive. But something that he did, he co-authored a paper called A Phenomenological Review of Graduate Hiring, in which he collected lived experiences of students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds going through the graduate application processes. So, Kieran, a question for you. From your research, if you want to share also your own experience, can you offer a couple of recommendations for those seeking to enhance their recruitment practices and make them more inclusive with a focus on considerations, perhaps? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steffi. I think you described yourself way better than I ever could, so thank you. So I do think that search mobility is something relatively new within the D&I space. I think it's definitely something which I've seen a lot of progress done over the past couple of years. But I think what is often missed when we're talking about search mobility is how do we look at individual stories to craft our strategies and how we really go about change. And that is something I really wanted to do within my research. So the very first thing I wanted to say is the first step to changing practices is to realize what the problem is in the first place. And I think my first recommendation for that is always for you to record your class and intersectional pay gaps, and also how is the organization constructed in terms of people at different rungs of the ladder, corresponding to their socioeconomic background when they were a child. So when we're doing data collection, a measure we often use from the Social Mobility Commission is what was the occupation of the male household earner when you were 14? And that really helps to give some context to your upbringing and what kind of background you came from, and ultimately your education as well. And I think it's really interesting because last week was actually a class pay gap there. So this is the day when those from working class backgrounds in professional occupations stop earning relative to their peers, which were already from professional backgrounds. So the class pay gap is put at 12 to 13%. And there's a lot of intersectionality here. So when you have a working class woman, the class pay gap to a professional managerial man is 31%. And the biggest ethnicity gap is also when you have someone Bangladeshi from a working class background, and they have a class pay gap of 26 to 27% compared to a white person from a professional managerial background. Now, why am I saying this? Because I think as economists, we like data, we like statistics, and I think it's that very first step of understanding what the problem is. And research from KPMG and Bridge Group shows that it's not only recruitment, but also retention that's the problem. So socioeconomic background is the most limiting factor on a person's progression within their organization. So there are three themes in which my paper went into for how you can change your recruitment practices. And these were very informed by how the students we interviewed faced their processes. So the very first one, we wanted to put a bit of a positive spin on it. I realized that when we look at D&I in terms of social mobility, sometimes we can get a bit bogged down in what challenges are people facing. But actually, we saw a lot of opportunities here. So, for example, working class students score low on measures of confidence and networking skills, but they score very highly on measures of resilience, grit, and determination. And they often are seen to work harder than their peers in terms of being able to apply themselves and being able to bounce back to problems that they face. And that's something which a lot of our students really wanted more people to see. A lot of students, when they were applying for elite careers, they were instantly put off because they thought having careers like McDonald's, which they worked part-time during university, or having caring responsibilities so they couldn't get a job would immediately put employers off. And so they wouldn't apply in the first place. So when you have an organization and there looks to be a problem in terms of socioeconomic diversity, which, as we know, economics is rather undiverse at the moment, and we're still making progress. But when you're an outsider and you see that problem, you don't really want to get involved because you aren't going to look like a perfect person and a perfect fit for an organization. And it put a lot of people off. And so what we really wanted to look at was looking at potential, not polish. So research from Louise Ashley shows that when you're in a recruitment process, there is an immediate bias towards someone who sounds more polished, who has an RP accent, who can talk the talk, and generally is able to articulate themselves well. Now, we know that those from working class backgrounds unfortunately score lower on those metrics because they don't have experience with shaping soft skills. So in this case, I think that D&I needs to be embedded through your interview processes. And ultimately, whoever interviews an individual needs to contextualize those interviews in order to understand this person, might have worked at McDonald's alongside their degree. However, what skills has that gained that are transferable? That means that that person, even though they don't have corporate work experience, can still be a very good fit for that role. And I think there are a lot of exclusionary barriers that get placed in terms of being biased towards people with corporate work experience already or academic experience already. And And there are also the second theme, so resource gaps first. So people are very unlikely to know people within the organizations and fields that they want to go into when they're from a low socioeconomic background. So they unfortunately don't have any family members or friends that are in those types of careers. So it is very difficult to get help. It's very difficult to get mentors. So something I really benefited from personally was the charity Upreach, which gives mentors to students from low socioeconomic backgrounds to help them get into their career. And that really helped me personally, but a lot of students didn't know about Upreach and they felt like they didn't have anyone to help them through the process, which made them feel very unconfident, very unprepared. And that ended up manifesting into the outcomes of those interviews when they were rejected because they didn't feel like they were able to get themselves across in the right way. Because they didn't have mock interviews, because they hadn't had practice tests before, they hadn't had anyone to sit down and tell them what they needed to say and what they needed to do in order to impress someone in an interview environment. And there are also financial difficulties faced in processes. So a couple of recommendations on that very quickly. So to do with, please, pay your interns if they're doing work for you. Please pay for travel for interviews. A lot of students said that they were put off by the need to pay for their own travel for interviews because they couldn't afford it. And that meant that they instantly withdrew from processes which they felt like they could have been a good fit for because they didn't have the money to be able to apply themselves in interviews. And also starting loans and bonuses, please, for new starters. So something which one of our students mentioned was that they received a graduate offer that they had to decline because they didn't have the money in order to be able to start within that organization. Because they were moving to London and not having any money meant that they couldn't afford housing deposits, they couldn't afford professional clothing, and this was a big barrier for them. And also timing as well. So in terms of timing, Spring Insight schemes were a particular issue. So Spring Insight schemes are often advertised near the start of the academic year in first year. However, if someone is from a state school background where there isn't a good careers education, it's very difficult to know about different careers and sectors that are hiring, and therefore it's even more difficult to get on these Spring Insight schemes because they don't know what careers there are and they don't have a background in order to be able to know how to get into it. And they kind of have to catch up, People from those professional managerial backgrounds have years of experience on someone from a state school background. Like myself, I applied to Spring Insight schemes in my first year. I was very unsuccessful because I didn't know what finance was at the time, and now, here I am. But just having that knowledge of careers that are out there is something which you can't take for granted when it comes to someone who isn't from the background where they know things like consulting and banking and finance. And how am I doing for time, Steffi?
I think if you have one final comment, otherwise we have a few questions coming in.
Thank you. Very, very final comment, which has been repeated a lot, is to do with the tone and the sort of culture within an organization and how that helps someone to get into interviews. So remembering that, when someone is doing an interview, that interviewer very much determines how successful they are within that interview. So what we saw was if the person wasn't able to kind of link with the interviewer that they had very different hobbies. The interviewer liked golf and skiing, but this person liked, watching TV and doing rugby on the weekend. It's very difficult to find any sort of connection for good conversation within these interviews. And that ultimately made them less successful in terms of, that sort of cultural and social capital. So
thank you very much, Kieran. A lot of food for thought. I would like to pick on something perhaps that you said and start with some of the panel conversations. And I'm going to try to link the two. We have been talking about here recruitment at a very young level, but also recruitment in academia. Something that we do in academia is ask people to add in the CV only relevant experience when we are going for roles in academia and lecture. But of course, you mentioned that, we have people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, for different backgrounds, are more likely to have experiences in different sectors, working at McDonald's, working in different areas, because they have supported through their studies through these jobs. And so that's something interesting. I now wonder how all our advice to add only relevant experience into our CV is perhaps penalizing people who come in from different backgrounds that cannot add that experience. But a more general question comes from Elena, and perhaps I'm going to ask Denise and Lisa and LDM if you can address this. So we have the upcoming economics job market. And of course, backgrounds is something that perhaps is a little socioeconomic backgrounds is more difficult to find. So is this indirectly also saying that we should look better at candidates from less famous posh universities, for instance? How can we kind of take into consideration the socioeconomic background when we are hiring in academia?
It's a good question, Steffi, isn't it? And it's actually a challenge because it informs everything you are as an academic. It's not just what's on your CV, but also your chosen areas of interest and whether they're perceived as valuable in the discipline. So I think the European job market questions in the chat really have touched me, because I'm chair of the Education and Training Committee, and that particular product sits with us, doesn't it, Mary Louisa? And it's something I've personally been quite uncomfortable with for a while, because its structure isn't particularly helpful in lots of ways, and moving it online was better than the old model. I remember some discussions around the location of some of these interviews and how they were happening in the past. And it might be something that we just need to take away as a committee and have a really deep dive think, and maybe ask people like Kieran, like Faith and LDM to come and ask, give their thought about what they think, or colleagues on the call, because it is definitely something that we need to look at, but we haven't, we've sort of accepted it as a product from our history, but we haven't really looked at how it works. So as chair, I'm happy to put that on the agenda. Let's have a discussion about that at ENT and take some soundings about how to make.
Thank you, Denise. I think you are blocked now, but that was a good moment, so we can go to LDM.
Can I just ask you to repeat the question for me, please?
Yes. So I think the question is more basic, like, how can we take into account the socioeconomic background? This is not a visible characteristic. And when people applying for academic jobs, it's not something that you usually put on your CV. I'm from lower socioeconomic background. So is there anything that we have to take into account? And in particular, the question here was about, do we need to look at people coming from less posh universities, less elite universities, for instance?
Oh, okay, that's a really interesting question. I'm going to just flip it a little bit, if that's okay. One of the things that I would say that it's more important to look at intersectionality of the individual, because where we have people that are from different socioeconomic backgrounds with different races, different religions, different cultures. And I think intersectionality is a central point to recruitment and employment, retention and reward. And it covers the statistical information as well. The thing that I would say is that when we're considering recruitment, is that we need to consider that for individuals that are wanting to become employed, the thing that I always say to my mentees is that if you don't recognize the value and quality in yourself, how do you expect somebody else to celebrate it? So this is really important, being able for individuals to identify their values, their principles in alignment with the organizational culture and the strategy of the company and the values of the company, and align themselves to it. I'm a great believer in a consideration of the great and the good. There are some great things that you've done and some good things that you've done. And how can you align that with the strategic objectives of the company that you're leaning into? So from my perspective, I would say intersectionality is important, but also considering the fact when you're in an organization, I'm also a great believer in everybody should be a performance manager, whereby we can actually think about structure and coordination. So we can actually onboard individuals and they've got the capacity and also the stakeholders to ensure that they're actually succeeding and thriving.
Thank you very much, Agnes. If I can add something, yes, we show research shows that people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to attend the local universities for various reasons, due to cost, due to the schools that they attended. So of course, it's going to be also more likely that they continue their career in these universities. And we see that the PhD student, a division between like elite universities attract students from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. So I do think it's worth to kind of consider what universities not from the elite have to say. I think also Joe had something to add. Joe, do you want to add something in kind of 1 minute too?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about my own experience because I came from a background where I didn't understand any of this stuff at all. And I was very, very lucky to be able to overcome that for various routes. But of course, the kind of people, I'm sure many of us are experiencing this, that come through the academic job market are way better than I ever was, or indeed am now. And that's because they're receiving an incredibly focused education that there is very little chance that I ever would have been able to access. So, I mean, it's a sort of real kind of, equity versus efficiency trade-off we're facing here. And I think that we're so far in academia from the kind of discussions that our private sector colleagues are having here, that it's really a very big challenge, particularly for highly research intensive institutions. So I'm just sort of putting it out there really. And maybe, anyway, I'm not sure how much we can translate what our colleagues are saying into our sector because it is so far apart.
We can really push for our widening participation strategies. We need to work through the whole pipeline, I think, and we need to make sure that kids from all backgrounds have access to all universities based on what they can do. So I think that's very important. And I really appreciate the work that Discover Economics does for this, because it becomes important. I agree, if we need to bring people through the pipeline, but we need to start from somewhere. Starting at the very beginning hopefully helps. So I had also, we have a question for, sorry, I lost it, from Emma to Faith. Faith, I was particularly interested to hear about your internship scheme. Do you expect eventually that some of the interns will apply for permanent roles when they graduate? Were you already running an internship scheme for students from any background before?
Yeah, so no, we weren't running an internship. What we do run is a student, or have run for 20 years, is a student placement scheme, which is for students who are doing a year in industry. And that has been a really successful recruitment tool. Our chief UK economist, Paul Dales, who I hope some of you will know, was our original student. So it's lovely to have a number of stories like that through the business. And that is absolutely our hope for the DEI internship. We were really pleased to hear that all 5 were keen to return to the business in roles as economists, and so we hope that they will at some point. We did make an offer to one for our grad scheme, and then actually she decided that she wanted to work in more of a consultancy, so we're a little bit disappointed about that, but yeah, we hope that would feed our pipeline down the line. But that was only that was a big part of the motivation for doing it, as well as just giving those opportunities for people in underrepresented groups as well. So there were sort of 2 prongs to why we started it.
Thank you very much, Faith. And Denise, I think you joined us just now, but I think we got your main points before. I just want to say, perhaps, okay, I have another message worth highlighting. This is not a question, but related to what Kieran says about interviews. We have put videos of example interview questions for graduate economists on our website to help candidates know what to expect. We had positive feedback from applications about these. And this is really great. Thank you. And I think what this panel, I'm going to try to close this panel very slowly now because we can move to the second session. But I think something that came out from this panel is that, we cannot think separately about all these issues. We cannot think about, well, that's the public sector, that's the private sector, that's academia. because we are all interconnected in a way. We need to start thinking all together, starting from the very beginning of the pipeline, because otherwise we are going to be competing from this very, very small pool of resources and talent. And we need to actually, to make a better society, a fairer society, to start by allowing people, everybody, to get access to the best education that they can. And that's not depending on their background, but it's depending on their abilities. So I really have to say thank you. I just want to remind you all that, of course, there's a lot of ideas thrown there and catchy things. The whole point is that we start having these conversations here, and you hear from these people. And I'm pretty sure, because I know all of them, they are very nice people, very committed. If you reach out to them and we want to brainstorm, they are really happy to do that. But also kind of we all together can bring some of these topics back to the network in the future as well. So just the starting of the conversation, not the end, hopefully. But I think something else that came out of this conversation is the importance of having these networks, of having these points of contact to kind of move on. Again, thank you very much, everybody, all the panelists, for keeping to time. This has been amazing. And for being here, for taking time. Thank you very much. And I think now we move to the next session.